So my name is Yoshiyota. Half of you actually call me Yosh, and I'm hoping the other half will join, including yourself, Christine. And so just call me Yosh. Let me just explain some of the format and principles. It's basically three main things. One is this is a Chatham House rules, which basically whatever you say over here in this meeting stays here. We're going to tweet. We're not going to hold you accountable for whatever you say. So this is really free talk platform. So I want everybody to understand that. Is that okay? So it's more like, just for the courtesy. Good. Thank you, Chris. And second thing is make space, take space. Basically be mindful with others. And, looking at so many of your CVs and backgrounds, I don't have to explain anything. Just going to be courtesy. We just want to push the conversation rather than each other's agenda and opinions, which I don't really have to worry about it. So skipping. The third one is, again, when speaking, it's better to make one point. Again, I don't really have to say it. Pretty much everyone is used to this kind of conversation, but this is a little new to me because it's on a Zoom. It's a lot of very different people. Some of it I don't really know, so I'm a little bit nervous. And to tell the truth, I'm doing it with the from my kind of like a home setting, which kind of like gives me a less kind of like a facade of legitimacy. But I hope you guys don't mind that because everybody is in the same place. So when you speak, just make a one point and then pass it to others. So, more you can pass it to others, more you can make it inclusive. I think conversation will be better and we can achieve something together for next 2 hours. So that's the rule. Everybody understood? Okay, thank you very much. And whenever I say something like this, either nod or going like this, or like, if you don't feel comfortable, you can just make a face. I'm basically watching everybody's face. So if you're not really feeling comfortable, please let me know. I give you a floor to speak about it. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the context and problem statement. Well, context pretty much Christine explained. We're going to work on SDG, particularly on SDG 14. And as you receive the memos from Christine and prepared document, we're working on 14.4 and 14.2. Simply speaking, overfishing and the restoration. And we have two questions, the guiding questions. One is the technology and the methodologies used in the Pacific Northwest could be applied globally to protect ocean ecosystems and ocean-dependent populations. What are the challenges and limitations? And for applying technology in low resource setting. So when we say low resource, you can actually start looking into critically, what do we mean by that? And maybe we can just open up a conversation from there. The second question is, are there principles to use in knowledge and technology transfer that honor equity and cultures? How can organizations and companies in the US create a more equitable system for those in low and middle income countries? So that's the second question. First, how can you use the technology that we have in other settings? The second, how can we honor equity and the cultures by and through and potentially with those technologies, those applications? Those are basically two main questions. Is everybody clear about that? Okay, obviously you can go sidelines, you can just bring in new conversations in this, and then that's totally cool. It's a very difficult questions, but I'm hoping that with having you all, we can just start this conversation and then push it forward. So the first time is my time to explain what the setting is, what the problem is. So I'm going to give you my own, because the ocean is huge. Everybody's doing different things, and then you all practice in the various different settings, but you all care about the ocean and the peoples. So I'm going to take my turn to share with you what I think is a problem. So the first problem that I see is this is the ocean, and then this is the SDG, and then this is UN. often the conversation in those high levels stays in high levels. And it just ended up having very much top-down conversations and the policies and the solutions, which often undermines what people actually needs, what people cares, what people values. And then that's really difficult to just take everybody's opinion, everybody's values, cultural, and really to make high level solutions. So there's this gap between local setting and practitioner setting, and then those high level international commitment. For example, SDGs. Good thing about SDG is those country committed, but the bad thing about SDGs is somebody made somebody's future. The vision of the SDG doesn't necessarily reflect everybody's future, but we have that, right? So that's really the issue. So my thinking is, as we see the ocean has been changing and it's coming into the new era, considering climate change and our response to the climate change is becoming more and more in equal, in equitable space. And then that's what I'm really worried about. It's about the distribution and access of the resources. It's about the representation of values. It's really about the understanding of systematic inequality, which has been going on quite some time, and it will be even preceded and perpetuated in the future. So that is really my concern. How can we make ocean as an equitable and place where people can share the benefit best way in the most culturally adequate manner? So that's the challenge, and then that's concern, and that's what I'm hoping we can have this conversation with. Okay, so I'm done with my turn, and now floor is pretty much open. You can please speak freely and make it short. I'm sorry I spoke a little bit longer, but I hope you guys stick to the short time and then pass it to others. Okay, you can just raise the hands. Okay, being very quiet. Can you just point someone to start speaking? Will that be okay? As I don't really see anybody's hand. Okay, I'll pass it to my closest colleague. Andreas, would you mind start speaking?
Sure. I was worried about
You
that.
knew it was coming, right?
I felt that maybe it was. Thank you for the invitation. I mean, this is great. I spent some time looking everyone up. I obviously knew a lot of names already, but what a great group of people. It's a real honor to be invited to this. I actually had a question, Yoshi, before we got started, and I read a little bit too about the 17 Rooms initiative. And I'm just wondering, like, how much do we hope to achieve? Because like it can't have been easy to get like this great group of people together for whatever it is, 2 hours, 2.5 hours or whatever. So what are you hoping to kind of come away with this, like one single coherent vision? Because you did talk a lot about diversity, and people have so many different perspectives on this. Or do you want to kind of like segment that out into like a few different, I guess not competing, but complementary visions?
Okay. Really, my hope for the achievement is really everybody feels comfortable speaking to each other at the end of this meeting. That's what I'm hoping for. And then that's the achievement, and it's huge. So I really want everybody to have a chance to speak, and everybody feels more or less comfortable with a group, and so we can move forward with it. I don't really have an agenda to set up and any sort of like a solutions or anything in the end. If you have certain hints and ideas displayed, that would be great. So this is really to embrace the diversity that we have and expertise that we have in this meeting, and really sharing. And let's see how it goes. Yeah, I'm nervous looking Kristen, but she's smiling, so I suppose it's okay. Right. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve. Is that okay, Andres?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Anybody else can just start, sort of sharing your opinions about either how can we take how can we take our technology over here, Pacific Northwest, to outside in a different context, or how can we actually honor the equity through using technologies or anything else?
Sorry, yeah. So I'll get into that. Sorry about my side with the question. Yeah. So now we're getting into it.
Right.
I mean, I really like these questions. And so I don't know if everyone read the things. I'm Andres Cisneros Montemayor. I'm a researcher at UBC, Deputy Director of Ocean Nexus. And stuff is really interesting to me. I'm from a small fishing community in Mexico, Guaymas, which probably none of you have ever heard of, but it's a cool place. And when I read this, it obviously evokes a lot of my experiences with, I'm sure you've heard this before, feeling like some of the goals that are being brought to this type of community are not ones that are being set by this community, right? And so they might be actually great goals, right, for somewhere else, and they might even fit in with a lot of stuff that we're trying to do, but because the community didn't really express these goals themselves, there is that feeling of kind of being imposed on, right? And so I think often that's sort of like an immediate sort of barrier. And again, even when if you sat down and let people talk about them, you might come out at goals that are actually really similar to ones that are coming from somewhere else. But that feeling of imposition, I think, is really to me one of the first steps that we need to address, right? So before we even get into how do we implement these things? I can't remember exactly how you put it, Yoshi, but I think it's really good. The nice thing about larger policies like SDGs are that they express these goals, and yes, everybody signed up to them, including Mexico. But the challenge then at the same time is that feeling that they weren't specifically expressed by you. And so I think, again, that first step of, in terms of this question, how do we approach the community to make them, to make it really clear that we're not just looking for your input on how to implement something that's been decided, right? We want to actually talk about you, but what we even want to implement, right? And so I think that to me is something really important that can come out of this.
Thank you very much, Andres. Some sort of idea of co-design, inviting people to talk with the community. So now I'm going to push it to another, I'm so sorry, I actually do know those two people, so I'm going to push it to another fisheries economist at the UW. Chris, would you mind sharing your thoughts about this?
Sure. Yeah, I guess, so I'm a fishery economist in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at UW. I do a fair amount of work with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which manages off Alaska, but also work quite a bit internationally, including a lot of work for FAO and World Bank, doing sort of triple bottom line assessments of fishery management, largely in developing countries. And one of the things I'm kind of thinking about here is how the different institutions that we can use to catalyze change, right? And some of them, like local governance institutions, allow us to articulate goals and then sort of work back from the goals. And then the others, some others, such as markets, rely on individuals making decisions, and then there's sort of emergent properties at the community level, some of which might be good, like income coming from trade, some of which might be bad, like overfishing or things like that. So I'm sort of thinking about some of the tensions between what's been articulated in some of the goals, right? Some of the tensions between what's articulated in some of the SDGs in particular, some of which are focused on kind of economic development and suggest that trade in particular is a very good thing, and then others which are focused on sort of local food sovereignty issues, which suggest trade is a bad thing, and kind of thinking about who gets to decide that and who gets to, and whether the institutions are in place to let that even be a question, or if people are just going to sort of sort some of this stuff out on their own.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks a lot. So two academics spoken about these, and perhaps I wanted to hear something from the practitioners who and then also, researchers who worked with multiple stakeholders and in different types of interest and perhaps considering equity issues. Anyone like Tobias? I'm sorry, I put you on the spot, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Tobias Aguirre. I'm the CEO at Fishwise. So we're an NGO. We're dedicated to sustaining ocean ecosystems and the people who depend on them, specifically by transforming global seafood supply chains. So I could speak a little bit on the kind of the equity and principles through a specific project that we're pursuing right now, which is a USAID funded project in partnership with the Packard, Walton, and Moore Foundations. It's called the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability. And the core reason that we came together was that those philanthropic institutions were investing in electronic catch documentation and traceability systems around the world. Many, many pilots, but very little harmonization, seeing that they were being designed for different users for various purposes. And so we've created a project around ECDT principles to look at the environmental, financial, and social principles that need to be considered when especially a producing country is designing and implementing such a system. So to come up with those principles, we formed a consultative committee, 30 or 40 individuals from around the world, lots of different sectors represented. And in particular, for this conversation, we wanted to ensure that there was human and labor rights expertise represented in that conversation. And the three big kind of actions within the principles are to initiate, design, and then implement. And within each of those, there are equity considerations. So for example, under initiate, some of the principles are to be inclusive of identifying stakeholders, communicate benefits to foster participation, and consult stakeholders early and often. Under the design step, and the social component, we want to identify how worker welfare and privacy will be monitored and supported, and implement safeguards for worker rights and privacy, for example. We're also encouraging governments to look at human-centered design approaches. And then under implement, the third leg is to assess the benefits, limitations, and challenges of the system in relation to equity and worker welfare. So these principles are out under review, the second draft, and then they will be launched in the next month or so. Countries will start testing and implementing, and then potentially we will work with the FAO to see if they might adopt these principles. So just kind of a snapshot around a real project where we're looking to implement and address these equity principles. And then on the technology side, the SALT website, salttraceability.org, it's really is a global hub for traceability technologists. And so there's sections in there where there's a really great catalog of relevant technologies.
Thank you, Tobias. That's great. Very, interesting example of, how we actually bring in ideas and within the stakeholders. So I'm going to pass it to Laura from International Justice Commission, and who's been working in slavery issues and seafood. Laura, can you just speak a few things about it?
Sure. Thanks so much. My name is Laura.
Hey, Laura, I don't know if it's just me, but I think your microphone doesn't seem to be working. It's kind of
a little bit again,
staticky or something.
Thanks for letting me know. Is that better?
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No.
Yeah, so my name is Laura. I work for an organization called the International Justice Mission, or IJM. And I work on issues of forced labor and human trafficking. So very excited to participate in this discussion, especially as we're talking about inequities around fishing, illegal and unregulated practices, and bringing kind of the social side of that into the conversation. I see the issues of, environmental degradation and also labor exploitation as being very interwoven, especially when we're talking about illegal practices. As you know, we'll often find the exploitation of environment or of oceans to be happening in a situation where laws are not being enforced or regulations that are set up are not being enforced. And that is also where we're finding some of the most egregious human rights issues or abuses, like labor exploitation, forced labor, and human trafficking. And so I think as we're thinking about solutions, both for the protection of communities and the protection of people who are working in these industries, and also for the sustainability of oceans, to be talking about those kind of jointly. I think the common thread between those two issues is an environment of lawlessness or a lack of enforcement. And so I would want to call that out as a top concern and a challenge to be addressed, is how can we, in order to, bring broader impacts to communities, the onus really needs to be with those governments, both their buy-in in wanting to ensure protection for workers, and also their ownership of that solution. So yeah, excited to talk more about this today, but that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from. And if you're not familiar, International Justice Mission, just globally, we're a human rights agency working to protect people in poverty from different forms of violence. So like I said, I'm working on the forced labor and human trafficking side. And we have collaborated with, I think, many of you, especially in Thailand, working on issues in the fishing and seafood industry there. So.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I'll pass it straight to Julie, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Yoshi. My name is Julie Kuchapatov, and I'm the founder of SAGE, which is a recently, just 1 month old, launched initiative to build gender equality and women's empowerment in the sustainable seafood movement and global seafood production. So I have worked on environmental sustainability initiatives for years, and more recently, within the last 7 or 8 years, about social responsibility in the seafood, specifically kind of the subset where Tobias and I are kind of in the same circles. So the reason why I founded SAGE was because of what Andreas mentioned about this intersectionality of, or was it Andreas or was it Chris? Anyway, this intersectionality, because the sustainable seafood movement has a goal to increase the amount of certified, rated, or in fishery improvement project fisheries and fish farms around the world. It's currently at it's currently at 35%, and we want to increase that to 75% by 2030. So how are we going to do that? We have to scale and accelerate the solutions that we're looking at. And so the way that I would like to try and consider is very possible, is through gender equality. So getting to SDG 14 through SDG 5. And so by building gender equality in projects on the ground and including, like Andreas said, everybody there, because we need them, this should be locally led, these should be locally led initiatives. We can attain actually our environmental goals. That's the working hypothesis of SAGE. And I think it was interesting, and then I'll stop. I think it was interesting in the SDG handout that you sent us earlier. They did a good job of, there was a table about where we intersect, the SDGs intersect, and the gender equality bit is very small. So I would really encourage us to kind of think about, are we including gender equality data in, are we taking a look at sex disaggregated data when we're making solutions to solve these environmental problems that we're trying to solve? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. And I'll pass it to Anna.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Yosh. As Andres said, thank you for the invitation. This is a really great group of people, so I'm excited to hear what everyone has to share. So I'm an academic. I'm based in the School of Public Policy at Oregon State University, and so I have a human geography, political ecology background, and I guess one of the things that I've looked at when I look at ocean governance, I think of the disconnect, right? So everyone's talked about the things that are extremely important that they work on sort of as these apparently separate things, right? So there's a lack of perhaps of a unified vision of what that ocean narrative is. So the ocean coming onto the global governance stage through SDG 14, through the ocean decade, the decade of ocean science and sustainable development. These are all really great opportunities to center the ocean and really focus on that intersectionality between gender, between human rights, between land policies, so all the different areas that everyone is discussing. So I guess the way I'm thinking about is three things. One is sort of creating novel institutional arrangements that really focus on the local, like really thinking about the opportunities at the local level, and creating those institutions that give power to those local levels. The second part is to redefine the ocean narratives, to really think about what the future of the ocean is, right? So everyone has their own version of what that narrative might look like. So if we think about the blue economy, people think money, right? Other people think inequality. So what does it really mean? Can we find a shared narrative? And then the third point is, being that I'm in an academic institution, thinking about how we can increase interdisciplinary and more applied or real world science. So really linking the knowledge that an engineer can bring with a social scientist, with, sort of thinking about spaces where there are incentives for people who are thinking about this deeply in their silos can really interact. So those are sort of the three things that I've been thinking about in terms of how to achieve the SDGs or move those forward.
Thank you very much, Anna. So we start seeing, a lot of they're looking for the diversity, to achieve equity, but at the same time, we really have to, make it much more practical and applied. So I'm gonna pass it to. By the way, I'm actually sending chat to you guys privately, asking, would you like to speak next, and all this. I'm so sorry, this is confusing. And some of you say yes, and then I'll point it next, and then some of you say, don't really say anything, and then I'm still going to ask you. So I ask, okay, I'm sorry. So I'm gonna ask Tegan, is it okay to pass the floor to you, and then I'll give a sequence. So, and then after that, I'll ask Peter Seligman to speak, if that's okay, Peter. Thank you. So Tegan first, please.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to this session today, and it's great to see some familiar faces and some new people as well. So I am the executive director of Coastal Quest, and we are a revitalized nonprofit focusing on resilient solutions for people and nature, focusing on nearshore marine, so that includes fisheries, nearshore fisheries, and coastal people. And the coastal zone, we're defining 100 miles inland. And so prior to coming to Coastal Quest, which was earlier this year, I did over 15 years of consulting and worked with many of the people on this call today, doing various projects focused on fisheries and conservation. And I guess what I would say is that I think the opportunities and needs right now in the current context of where we are with COVID and climate change challenges is that we do really need to think about what are the realistic opportunities for sustainability that create opportunities for people as well as for nature, and thinking about fisheries management and technology in light of climate change and all that brings to the table as well. And I think there's a lot of, back to the questions that we're going to talk about more in, in our next part of the conversation. I think there are a number of models that, different community-led models and different geographies that can be shared and scaled up. And so I think it's really thinking about what are those best practices, how can we scale them and adapt them for the appropriate context of where, those people are living, and set those kind of realistic goals, but knowing that we do have a changing climate and people also need to live and thrive. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you very much, Tegan. You brought COVID, climate change, two most pressing issues. And I'll pass it to Peter to speak. Good to see you.
Sure.
Peter.
Thank you. It's good to see you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm here with my friend and co-founder of Neotero, Chris Filardi. We started Neotero about 3 years ago with an intense focus and total focus on working alongside of, in solidarity with indigenous peoples who control and live on so much of this earth, to support their efforts in securing culture and territories. And as you probably know, about a third of the earth is under the guardianship of indigenous peoples. And if you go into the oceans and go into the Pacific, it's even a larger percentage. So as I think about the challenges that have been raised, then you're talking about from fishing practices to policies. I think that there's some really important lessons that could be transformational if they could be adjusted, if we could adopt them. In particular, we're now working with a man by the name of Justice Joe Williams, who is one of the 5 Supreme Court justices in New Zealand, and he's a Maori and has been very successful in having British law in New Zealand evolve to incorporate the concept of kinship, so that rivers and mountains have legal standing. And so what we're exploring, and in a collaboration with the Earth Law Center, is and with Justice Joe and partners in the Pacific, is the idea of ocean kinship. Can there actually be a transformation of legal frameworks so that ocean or earth, rivers, mountains actually have legal standing? What we've seen actually is that in Chile, in Ecuador, in some of the Pacific islands, this is actually taking place already. It would be a really significant transformation in the government, in policy frameworks that recognize rights of kin. So I think that this is one, I think that what we have to be searching for is not just intensified enforcement of rules. We also have to be looking for what are the transformational changes in governance and policy that can elevate the standing of nature. The other thing is, which is separate really, but is definitely connected, is there's extraordinary deep wisdom over practice over millennia of how do you care for fisheries? Native Hawaiians, for example, have a policy, a culture that the big fish are released immediately because they have more eggs. The little fish are the ones that are kept. U.S. fishing regulations are exactly the opposite. So there are opportunities for transformational changes if we can begin to look at some of this traditional knowledge. And so from the perspective of Neotero, that's the focus, that we are really, we are dealing at. And the last thing I'd say is that we think also that the concept of natural capital standards of actually assessing the value of nature for economy is worthy of exploration. And I know many conservation organizations are looking at this, and there's a lot of good minds thinking about it, but we think that could actually have another transformational impact on the way the ocean and fisheries are managed and valued. So thank you for including us.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Chris, can I just move on if that's okay? Or did Peter say everything? You okay with that? Thank you so much. So I'm gonna go on another 5 minutes with this, and I'm gonna include as many people from this floor as possible. It might not cover everyone, but you have a time to speak afterwards. So now I'm gonna pass it to Erin. It's a yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this, Kristen. So I'm Erin Meyer. I'm the Director of Conservation Programs and Partnerships at the Seattle Aquarium. So I direct all of our research, field conservation, and policy advocacy work that we do here in the US, as well as overseas in the Coral Triangle. I think first, to just kick off, I think I want to echo some things that several folks have said, especially Anna, the importance of leaning into the intersectionality. I think in the ocean space, the intersectionality across disciplines, across cultures, and across SDGs, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And there's a lot of innovative conservation programs and projects that are off the ground right now that are really thinking about and leaning into that intersectionality. Before I get into a real life example, also just want to echo something that several others have said as well, specifically around the idea of moving this forward from an equity perspective. And for me, this really translates to focusing on capacity building and advancing local leadership. So those of us who are outside of the country where the work is taking place, or even outside of the community where the work is taking place, allowing yourself to put the local people and the local leaders forward, lifting them up, doing capacity building and training so that the work is really being led by those who are living in that space on the ground. And that means stepping back and being okay with not having your name, your organization necessarily being the one who is owning that work, but really stepping back and lifting up the local communities and the local organizations, because that's when the work is really going to keep going. And in this space that we're in right now in 2020, where travel is completely shut down, those of us who have been involved in projects that are international, the only reason why those projects are still going is because there are local leaders and local experts on those projects. Otherwise, those projects would have come to a halt. So I feel like there's a big spotlight on the need to make sure, especially with international programs, that there are local leaders on the ground really moving that stuff forward. And then more broadly, really thinking about conservation from there's this term that's getting more and more traction lately, this one plan approach term. And really what that means is that it's combining across things like spatial protections in the form of protection areas, protected areas, ensuring that there's enforcement and monitoring, of course, of those areas, but combining that kind of work with these other tools that are highlighted. I was looking in and reading that report on 14.2, and the highlights around the need to do restoration and species recovery. Those are really important to combine with protected areas. What we're finding, as I'm sure everybody knows, is that you have protected areas out there are certain things that are being restricted, whether that's fishing or other things in those areas, but some species aren't recovering. So you have to be able to combine protection of those spaces together with restoration for those habitats that aren't showing response to those protections, and also direct species recovery for the species who are also not showing response to just those spatial protections. And that's work that can be done in collaboration with aquariums and others who have captive rearing expertise and can be rearing those animals in human care and then releasing those animals, partnering with locals on the ground to get those animals and those ecosystems back up and running within those protected areas. And any of these projects, when we're talking about habitat restoration or species recovery or protected areas, again, just highlighting that need to be focusing on co-creating that work together with the people on the ground, with the indigenous peoples and the leaders and the fishermen who are most affected by this work. And then in the long term, again, focusing on capacity building so that you're making sure that as you're, say, shifting somebody further away from maybe leaning on extractive activities for their own economic benefit to maybe doing research or to caring for these animals that are now being released or doing tourism, that it's really important to lean in and make sure that there's a training component to those projects so that, again, those outside partners can be walking away and letting the locals lean that forward. And to put a real world example on that, there's a project that just got off the ground earlier this year that is coined the STAR project, or the Stegostoma tigrinum augmentation recovery project. It's a mouthful, but it's focused on recovering zebra sharks within the Indo-West Pacific. And this is a project that we just got off the ground about 8 months ago. There are now over 20 organizations who are partners across about 8 countries now. And it's a collaboration with academic institutions, aquariums and other NGOs, the tourist industry, and aquaculture leaders within the countries where the work is taking place. And we have Indigenous leaders and scientists and local experts sitting on the steering committee and the working groups. It makes things really complicated. It makes things move a little bit more slowly. But in the end, what it's going to mean is that the project is going to have a larger impact and really set the stage for new projects and other projects on other species going forward. So it's really thinking about not only the focus of that first project off the ground, but how you can build capacity so that the next project is maybe being led by, again, those in the country where the work is taking place. And with that, I'll pause.
Okay, thank you very much, Erin. There's a lot there, and I'm gonna ask one more person to speak, and we're gonna move to Kirk to speak, and then break room, which leaves 5 or 6 people here not to be able to speak in the first session, but I'll make sure I'll create the room. So apology for those who haven't spoke. Peter, Terry, Gerald, Blake, Kate, and Kelly, and a couple other people. I apologize, but you have a time afterward if that's okay with you. Is that okay? Right, thank you very much, Peter, nodding. I much appreciate that. Right, okay. So I'm gonna ask Bill to speak and then pass it to Kirk afterwards. Bill, please.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So it's really been fun listening to all these passionate experiences here and ideas, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm Bill Dewey with Taylor Shellfish Farms in Washington State. And thinking to the questions we were asked to focus on, there are a couple ideas come to mind for me. Is one, here in Washington, we lead the country, the United States, in farm shellfish production. So obviously we have a lot of knowledge and technology that people are able and willing to share. We've also been at tip of the spear for ocean acidification and impacts from ocean acidification and our ability to produce our shellfish seed. And with that has come a lot of science and knowledge and lessons learned. Out of that, we have a Blue Ribbon Panel report here that guides Washington State's response to ocean acidification. That's become a model that's being used throughout the world. From the West Coast states' efforts, there's formed the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification, and that organization is helping countries all around the world develop response plans for ocean acidification. So again, lots of experiences and knowledge there to share around that, and how countries with limited resources can still respond to those issues. I'll stop there. I know we're over time here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So now we're gonna have a little pause for the plenary, and then I'll ask Kirk to speak quite some of the works the Vulcan's doing and some of the perspective he has for the future. But before that, I'd really like to thank everyone for this session. And after Kirk speaks, we're going to kick off into outside intervention, which is breakout room discussion. In the breakout discussion, you have more smaller group to speak about same theme and free discussion. And I'm hoping that you bring back some of the things you discussed later to plenary again. So I'll pass it to Kirk. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoshi. Yeah, I was asked to speak about a few of the initiatives that Vulcan has done recently, and I picked out a few of our global data products that we've worked on, all collaboratively. First, kind of framing it as well, and the thinking that I've been trying to do. My background's in engineering, but I've been actually sliding gently into our philanthropic programs group. All of these projects I worked on the engineering side, and kind of guided by ideas around what is inclusive design for interfaces and insights and indicators, driving us at the right scales and levels, and what do we do as far as co-creating with stakeholders. And not necessarily all of it realized yet, but yeah, that's been sort of a guiding theme and certainly a learning that we've taken out of these projects. And also thinking more about the complex systems that we work in, the socio-ecological systems in particular, and how looking at the projects that we're working on, how does that drive our thinking around measurement and evaluation of our work? So, Vulcan, is a little bit of background, for those who aren't familiar, was Paul Allen's company here in Seattle, an umbrella company over all of the various things that he was interested in. It's technically for profit, because it included our real estate, our investment work, football team, and so forth and so on. But it also includes the departments that we call our philanthropic departments, those being the actually eponymous philanthropy department that works most directly with the foundation, the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation, which funds a lot of our philanthropic work. And then we had our product team, which is our engineering group, our communications group, Vulcan Productions, our movie making group, and our government and community relations group. And collaboratively, we work on all of these programs. So here it's 3 of them that I worked on since 2016 that hopefully just provide a little something to chew on during the breakout groups. The first, which is probably very familiar to many of you, and certainly to Andres, is the See Around Us project that we worked on both through philanthropic funding and through our engineering group in 2014 to 2017. We were involved with the See Around Us project, which many of you know, of course, is reconstructs global marine fisheries catch, spatially distributes it, and disaggregates it by a number of different sector, taxon, gear, and so forth, and then builds on that with tools and other research activities, providing insight into the data set. From a Vulcan perspective, we'd funded See Around Us with a grant that was really directed at country level engagement on how to use the data from the project. But simultaneously, my team on the engineering side then worked with the See Around Us team to build out both data quality, applications, data provenance tracking, improving the databases that underlie the project. But I think most importantly, working with the team to open up the data sets for free and public download access, something that hadn't been available up to that point. And then also collaborating with them on interfaces for programmatic access. So I worked with the Ben Halpert's team at the Ocean Health Index and our open science community to help build ways of accessing the data quickly and easily from programmatically, which expanded its availability. In 2015, we initiated a project called the Global FinPrint Project. This was again both a PGAF grant, a Paul G. Allen Family Foundation grant, plus in-kind work from our technology group, and wrapped up last year, 2019. This was a global study of shark abundance on tropical coral reefs. It actually brought together 7 PIs from around the world, Australia, US, and Canada in particular, and sampled shark abundance on 470 reefs by the conclusion of the process. And they're using a rather low-tech approach, actually, which allowed this kind of scaling. It's called BRUVs, or Baited Remote Underwater Video. So basically a small frame or a tripod with a GoPro or 2 for stereo, and then a bait bag that hangs off the end that provides an attractant. And so ended up collecting 15,000 hours of video from these 470 reefs, because about 50 drops of BRUVs on each reef. So rather low tech on that side, but actually ended up being rather high tech on the other side, because as you can imagine, the analysis of all of those data were a huge challenge. So fleets of undergrads, being probably wildly underpaid for their time, but going through and annotating the video and then building out the database analyses behind that. So followed that on actually with or coupled part of it with a study of environmental DNA at the same BRUV stops, and looking for the correlations between what the eDNA revealed as well as the BRUV videos. So our contributions there from a technology side were building out the annotation tools, analysis tools, and so forth on top of that. So that project's led to a bunch of research, most recently the big kind of comprehensive paper that came out in July of this year in Nature. It's McNeil et al. But looking into insights or drivers of shark depletion on the coral reefs, roles of sharks in the tropical reef ecosystems, and some recommendations for socioeconomic challenges that need to be addressed to decrease the overexploitation of sharks. And lastly, we have an ongoing in-house project we call Skylight that uses automatic identification system, AIS data, coupled with some in-house built machine learning on top of that, focusing primarily on ship-to-ship rendezvous from the AIS data that might be indicative of transshipment activities, refueling, or other things. Particularly there as well, what we call dark rendezvous. So where you have 2 AIS tracks of 2 ships that come together, and one of them turns off their AIS and disappears for a bit from the AIS track, and the other one slows down or does some other behavior that might be indicative, again, of transshipment. And then suddenly this one turns on its AIS somewhere else. And So they make these predicted sort of rendezvous or dark rendezvous using only one side of the rendezvous. So also looking at ways of reconciling the AIS data with synthetic aperture radar data from satellites, electro-optical data from satellites as well. And then simultaneously trying to build this national level analytic capacity that can make use of it. Recently announced on that dimension, many of you are familiar with the Global Fishing Watch project. So we've established a collaboration between the two since they're actually obviously very complementary. So yeah, understanding the capacity and the infrastructure requirements to make use of these is, one of the big things on my list, to try to better understand that. And there's so many of these tools which actually exacerbate issues as far as capacity goes. More tools means more capacity usually necessary. And so how do we avoid that, but yet not try and appeal to a single one-stop shop, solve everything, try and think, because I think we all know that's probably never going to happen, or shouldn't, in fact, because some specialization is appropriate. And so how do we federate? How do we interoperate? How do we work together on these things? And also back again, co-creating the interfaces for that, and with the right stakeholders at the right levels. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirk. A lot there. So we're gonna go into the breakout rooms. So a few of you is gonna be in one rooms, and you're gonna continue to talk about the same thing. But here I'd like to give you something, I'm hoping that you guys talk about. I really want you guys to talk about potentially, what are the principles when you're using your technology, when you're doing your projects with your partners, what is your principles? And it could be protocols, it could be anything, your values, or it could be your objectives, or it could be transparency in the governance. What is the principles do you have? Or even clearly, who's your client? The second thing that I'm hoping to get from you is, there are a few challenges and a few new areas that we actually have to think about it. And if you have any cutting edge example of how you overcome or how you tackling with the places where you don't really have a data, you don't really have a connection, you don't really have any foundation to work with, how are you going through it? Is there any challenges you face right now or under COVID, everything else? And the last one is, I want you guys to talk about potentially about your responsibility. You're all in different kind of either working for the agency as an academic, but we all have a responsibility to work on these issues, because this is not just a Pacific Northwest, but it is global scale that we are tackling with. So really to talk, potentially, if you could, talk about the principle, talk about some challenges or some cutting edge, method or anything you did this, really worked. And the last one about responsibility. If you can just talk about those things in a breakout room, that'd be great. And please do have be mindful with the time and the space, and so we can get many people's opinion about it. Is that okay? If there is anything else you guys want to talk together, please do in your own breakout room. Okay. Kristen, I suppose we are ready. Are we ready?
Yeah, and my colleague Pratima will go to breakout room. We'll be there for about 40 minutes. Each of you have a facilitator in each of your breakout rooms, and then we'll come back together. So, Pratima, can you?
Yep, I'll open breakout rooms.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going into the breakout rooms now. Okay, while we're waiting, so we just relax a little bit.
There should be a dialog box in front of you now that says inviting you, and you just hit join there.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Looks like a bunch of us are waiting for the breakout.
It looks like it didn't assign, so I'm assigning all of you right now to breakout. I'm sorry about that.
This might be it.
Yeah, I think I.
A quick report out, if that makes sense. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so okay, I'm gonna start with my own group. I had a tremendous group. It was very nice conversation. Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Erin, and Tobias, and Gerald, and Stephanie took notes, and also Laura, of course. And our conversation, we came out, a lot about the principles. We started thinking about like, okay, we need a government. We need an industry buy-in. We need a lot of communication to get these technologies and innovations to be spread out. And we really have to consider about the partnership. We have to be very mindful about the relationship. It's not like we're asking the power or capacity, but we are kind of like creating an equal partnership. And we have to be mindful, that technology or innovation is not always a good thing. And so we really have to think about what is useful, what needs to be considered as sort of like a negative impact. And to be to take advantage of someone who's summarizing it, I put the point, we done all this, and we're still in a place, you know, all of us in the Pacific Northwest, we're in a place where we can make a choice. We don't have to, we can use the data, we can use a method, we can use a technology which is kind or nice and suitable for our model of the solution. What if that we don't have a choice? And then that's a lot of, you know, context that people out there are facing. And perhaps thinking about it to make one more step to push forward how we're going to use the technology is probably our responsibility. That's the sort of things we talked about, and I'm hoping that my colleagues are okay with. Okay, sort of, right? Good enough. Thank you, Tobias. Okay, I'll pass it to yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Kristen. So it's
Sure. Yeah, I had a great group too, and we talked a lot about data collection as it relates to technology, and that there's actually no incentive to do data collection at a community level, and that but that's exactly where it's needed, and that the data collected should be of value to the communities rather than sitting on a shelf with centralized government, or only for large scale fishing. So again, the idea of figuring out what data can be pushed to communities and that is useful for those in particular. Again, we emphasize the issue of co-creating, only being only going to where you're invited into communities as a starting point, and really thinking about meeting people where they are when you go into doing co-management. Especially there are a lot of areas where the group was working where there were either weak governments or governments that lack resources. So figuring out ways how to create some social structures where it's lacking, where governments are lacking. And one was around creating more co-ops or socializing group of fishers, because sometimes that's not there at all. And then really looking at where they're needed. Kelly is working up in Alaska and really thinking about emphasizing that these are extremely thin margins in this industry. And in Alaska right now is a horrible salmon year. So thinking about the profit incentive versus companies like hers, her company as starting point is aligning value and sustainability. So, you know, which is very difficult when there's thin margins. So, but really figuring out where the principles are aligned and first. Let's see. Those were a lot of the things we came around with, but again, the principles that were consistent, but figuring out what we can do with data as a collective, and then analyzing that data to be useful for the community level was kind of a continual theme of what we were looking at. So I'll pass it to, I think, Ben, are you reporting out?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. But we had a shared learning. We spent a lot of time thinking about both the principles and the individual responsibilities and accountabilities together, and discussed, you know, as a starting point for many of us, the principle of equity, but also one of our teammates introduced the idea that we need to really stop and think about a pluralistic definition of the ocean, that we don't get trapped in a commodity basis, that respect for cultures that define the ocean as a living being. And so that led to conversations about processes that Terry and others shared about locals being able to express their notions of what is sustainable and what is appropriate, which led to a conversation about the importance of sort of user-generated design processes. So those principles carried through to conversations about data, but it was really important also that in talking about the principles, that there's some kind of 10-year certainty for representatives of the aquaculture sector in particular, that ironically, though potentially seemingly paradoxical, could lead to more sustainable practices and more investment and more engagement on long-term sustainability of the regions. We then landed on a notion of accompaniment around some of these issues as an important principle. And then as we switched gears and talked a little bit about data, we also, again, reflected on some of the members of the group reflected on processes that have embraced the complexity of some of these socio-ecological process questions, and that it was really critical in these processes to be bottom up and then reveal where resources are available. But I will stop there and see if any of my group wants to jump in or augment. Got a double thumbs up.
You got a thumbs up. Okay, Kristen, how long do we have? We've got 7 minutes. Okay, I want to be truthful for my colleagues over here. People like Peter, Kate, Kelly, Gerald, Blake, Terry haven't really spoken in the plenary. Would you like to make a little intervention, or if it's not, yeah. Anybody wants to speak?
Yosh, I
Please?
can say something quick.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. I felt like I owe it because you caught me off guard last time and I didn't speak quick enough. So one thing, I mean, we're talking quite broadly, I think, on a lot of these principles. And something that came up in our group was issues about alignment between regulation and industry. And I think that's a really important topic. But one thing I think that's worth always considering is getting down a bit more into specific contexts, and specifically how things are different between so-called developed and developing nations. So that relationship between government, regulators, and industry, I think, will be a big something that's going to be quite different when you're talking about a country in North America, let's say, versus like a small island state. And so the power a regulator has over industry might be quite substantial, and the power to actually get an industry player to act a certain way might be quite substantial in the US, let's say, but governments might be willing to forego a lot of their regulations to attract industry in some smaller nations. And so I think that the relationship between regulators and industry is going to be different depending on the context of play. And I think that's going to be an important thing to focus on as we try to narrow down more and think about the details of some of these principles.
Okay, thanks, Gerald. I'd like to ask maybe 1 or 2 more comments. You guys okay? Right. Peter, you've been nodding so nicely, and I just can't help.
I like the sun reassurance.
Thank you. Thank you. Kelly?
Sure. I can add something.
Please.
In my session, I kind of mentioned that my work up here in Alaska, we have coastal communities here who are heavily dependent on fishing or on fisheries resources, on our oceans, but you don't see that reliance really reflected in the approach to local economic development. I think that's been a failure here. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. So when we think about addressing these issues, how are we thinking about this as part of a comprehensive local economic development approach? Because we do know that those that rely on our oceans and our fisheries resources, they have to be able to put food on the table. They have to have jobs, that pay a living wage. There's that starting point. And when we're thinking about, local economic development approaches, those, again, my experience really is here in Alaska. We see kind of focus on like the cruise ship industry or tourism, and you know, those in charge of local economic development not thinking about, you know, ocean acidification or climate and how these things are affecting their resources and thereby, you know, impact their ability to develop their economies locally. So, you know, I think of like, who are the local economic developers of the future, you know, and how do we train them differently? How do we support different approaches? I think about that also from an entrepreneurship perspective, and, you know, the company that I work for now having very values-based, you know, values-oriented entrepreneurs who are just going about business in a totally different way, from a very different starting point. So the, you know, the future to me, if we can, you know, create and support entrepreneurs who have, you know, those values, and we create, you know, local economic developers who also approach these issues from a much more comprehensive perspective. I think that will better enable success.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would actually, really, that rings true what Kelly just mentioned. I think a lot of the work that we do and some of the countries that we work in is we literally see tons of money being poured out in economic development for white elephant projects, or just money that's going to things that are actually deteriorating. And I think from the perspective of, we try to work very closely with those agencies to develop kind of joint strategies of where are these problems, and they aren't in the fisheries, they aren't active in them, they aren't seeing these problems firsthand and able to engage with the communities. It's not part of their role in the places that we work. They can't get in deep enough, so they really need these partners to help them understand is, where should we be placing our money? Who are those groups, whether they're for-profit companies like Sitka Salmon Shares, or work we do with other partners in these communities, of how could we more effectively utilize this money? Because I think we've all seen, you know, subsidies for fisheries, and this is, you know, some of that money, you know, goes to economic development that just is not effectively spent. And it doesn't kind of take more of a systemic approach to, here, I can fund a truck for this community, but this community doesn't have enough fish. It's not organized. They can't actually afford to run this truck and get their product to market. So what are ways, and that's one example, but there's a lot of money out there actually in the countries that we work with that comes from governments that is being either wasted or is actually being destructive in a lot of ways towards moving things in the right way. So we try to very closely work with these partners to understand, like, how can we think about a bigger vision, and what does that look like, and where are the places that you should be investing potentially to help move this forward.
Thank you very much, Peter. Kate or Terry, if you'd like to say a few words. I'm so sorry, it's past 3, but if you guys okay, it's
yeah. Yoshi, I think I made I made comments during the breakout that I'm happy with. I'll just very quickly note that you asked us to think about restoration and fisheries in particular, and in my experience, they require or have required different approaches, because people are willing to engage with restoration in a way that is perhaps not as desirable, or they have less appetite in fisheries. So I think there is a division there, and we can't treat them identically.
Thank you very much, Kristen. So I'll pass it back to you, but thank you very much for everyone. I really enjoyed this, and just the last thing. Whenever I have this kind of a conversation in New York or Vienna Cafe or in the UN, and people talk about like money, people talk about like pushing the government, you know, but they really do not forget there's this civil society group, you know, there's people like us who really can push this in different skills, with different knowledge, with different platforms, and I'm hoping that this has to be highlighted. So I want to thank, you know, Christine and Goalmakers, who's been, you know, let us to have this conversation possible. And I'll pass it back to Kristen.
Yoshi, thank you so much. First, for your leadership on this topic in general and helping facilitate it. It's been a tremendous conversation. And again, to emphasize, this is the beginning of a series of conversations that are happening. I failed to mention in the beginning, we are creating a report, a compilation of all of the 13 roundtables, again, using Chatham House rules, but we might come back to you to review the section on this roundtable so that we're accurately describing it. We're also, I put in the chat a link to our Goalmaker Forum on December 7th and 8th. You're all welcome. I hope you can attend. We're probably going to do a session specific to nature-based capital, which is relevant to everything you all just said today. And again, cross-cutting with other SDGs. I'm also working on a public event that's going to take place next Monday, November 23rd. Specific to equity for ocean dependent societies. So obviously a subset of everything we just talked about. Julie from SAGE is helping me on that event. So I'll get out the public announcement. That's one that you can invite all your colleagues to. We recognize this is a private invite only roundtable, but we want to get the word out about this whole topic to a broader audience. So we'll get the invite out and spread the word around that as well. So that's all for today, but thank you again. I know we're past our time. It was incredible conversation. I hope you all learned something that you can take back and implement and met someone new. Again, this is, I realize this is a tight-knit community, I'm starting to realize, and a lot of you know each other, but hopefully you met someone new too. So thank you all, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone, nice meeting everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great job. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks up.
Okay, that's it. See you later, Gerald, man.
Thanks, Yosh. See you later.
See you later.